I'm John Vasquez, a member of the Solano County Board of Supervisors and the alternate to BCDC. And you're going to hear from Supervisor Spering here in a little bit. He is the commissioner to the BCDC. But before we get started, I just want to introduce some of the electeds. But I want to thank BCDC and FEMA and all the staff that's here today. This is really a very important subject and a discussion that we all need to have, and how we go about protecting our assets, not putting them in the wrong places. But today, Senator Frazier is here. Jim? Senator Wolf could not be here, but she sent a letter indicating that she had some important business to do at the Capitol, and we thank her for that. But her one of her aides, Catherine Baxter, is here. Catherine? And Bill Dodd is also at the Capitol working, but his aide out in the field is Tom Barteen. Tom? Susan Bonilla is also not here, but I think Ron Turner is supposed to be here. I don't see Ron. Well, then some of my, obviously Supervisor Spering is here. I don't see Aaron? Well, they're better than Aaron. Mike Wilson. I shouldn't say that. I'll pay for that one. But some of our other county elected officials, Chuck Lamelli, treasurer, tax collector. You can write checks to him once or twice a year. He told me don't build anything in the floodplain. He doesn't want to have to devalue anything. And that's the assessor, I'm sorry. Mark Tonneson, county assessor. And then we have our own county sheriff, Tom Ferrara. Is Pete Sanchez here? Anyone from the city of Suisun? Staff? Councilwoman Laura?
John Kearns is here.
Yeah. Thank you. Councilwoman Lori Wilson is supposed to be here? No? All right. My mayor, Len Augustine. Len from the city of Antelope. Councilwoman Ryan Harris. Diana. Councilwoman, I know. My aide wants to make sure I don't miss anybody. Keep me out of trouble. But I was going to introduce from Rio Vista Councilwoman Constance Bowler. I was getting to the mayor of Dixon, Jack Bashley. And then Dan Woke. Dan. What are you now?
I'm a deputy county council
Today? Yeah. Mayor Davis? And then my boss, Regina Costello, county CAO. And Mark Houston from city of Benicia. Former mayor of Rio Vista, Dan Vick. Is there any other electeds that I missed? Oh, that skips A. Boris and Kelly from Supervisor Seifert, Supervisor Thompson's office. Excuse me, I didn't see them, so I didn't see you, so I apologize for that. But we also have folks from Travis. Would you stand up? Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your service to our country. With that, I'd like everybody to stand and we'll do a pledge of allegiance if we could. Please join me. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Well, I hope you enjoy what's being presented today because I think it's important stuff. And I'm going to turn it over to Supervisor Spering.
Well, good morning, everyone. I want to thank John Vasquez. He's been doing the heavy lifting for us here in Solano County, BCDC. So, John, thank you. Another person I want to introduce, just a good friend of Solano County, Zach Wasserman. He's the chairman of BCDC and providing great leadership. And Zach, thank you for all that you do, not only in the Bay Area, but in the state. You know, this is an issue that whether you believe in global warming or any of the other issues that are on the forefront today, one thing about sea level rise is this is something that we can measure. And it is something that we know is coming. And it's an issue that we're going to have an honest discussion about. And it's not one of those subjects that you can continue to ignore. You know, most of the people in this room probably won't be impacted by sea level rise, but this generation has a responsibility to bring this issue to the forefront and start talking about it and start really discussing how we're going to deal with it here in the future. So we have that responsibility for the next generation, and that's really what we're doing here today. You know, I want to thank Larry Goldsband, Larry, and his staff. You know, at the Joint Policy Committee, you know, Larry is bringing this issue to the forefront. And the one thing that Larry's doing that I really appreciate is that he's bringing partnerships in, he's making people aware of it, and it's just this awareness. And he's doing it through cooperation, working with the counties, the cities, the special districts, making sure that everybody has this awareness and understanding the impact that sea level rise has. You know, most of Solano County is not going to be impacted. I think downtown Sassoon is going to have a problem, and in Vallejo, but most of it will not have a direct impact. But when you start looking at the impact that sea level rise is going to have on transportation, it's going to be a direct impact. It impacts you know, both the Capital Corridor that goes through here. You look at the two major airports; they're both going to be impacted. The ports. And just the movement of goods throughout the region in the state of California. And so it's going to have an impact that's going to have to be dealt with. And it's this generation that really needs to start looking at that. The JPC, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, it's made up of MTC, AVAC, BCDC, and the Air District. And so we're finally bringing the four regional agencies together to start talking about sea level rise and the impacts. And it's all interrelated. It's all connected, and you start to understand that you know, one thing does affect another. And so, you know, as we look at the storms that we're starting to have, and you look at flooding, and you start getting the combination of these things that all coming in at one time, it really does create tremendous havoc to this system. And it, you know, today, you know, for me, the work that BCDC is doing is kind of like that 30,000-foot level. We're really looking at the region and the impact on what we can do and how we can work together and start addressing these very important issues. It impacts utilities throughout the region, and so, you know, this is kind of an introduction of what we're looking at, how we can deal with this, how we can work together, and some of the impacts that need to be addressed. And so it certainly is my honor. And, you know, Larry, before I ask you to come up and take over, where's Joe LeClaire? Joe, he's back there. Joe and I worked years ago together in downtown Sassoon, you know, and when I first got elected, I said, who the hell's BCDC, you know? And I'll tell you, I sure learned who the hell they were in a big way. But, you know, at the time, I thought it was a bureaucracy that really created a lot of problems for our community. But the added value that BCDC brought to that project for the public access and the way that downtown Sassoon project really works today, BCDC played a big role in it. And I just want to thank BCDC for the role that they played. And just adding a real quality to life to this region. They really take special attention to how people interact with this region. And so with that, Larry, I want to introduce the Executive Director, doing a great job bringing us all together and addressing these very important issues. Larry, thank you, sir.
Thank you. A former boss of mine once always told me, never kill a sale, so I'm going to be very short given what the supervisor just said. We are thrilled to be here, and we are thrilled to have been invited. I want to give credit where credit is due, and that is the Chair Wasserman looked at me and a lot of the folks on staff and said, we have to go out and we have to do road shows. We have to let the local electeds know what it is we're thinking about doing and how we do it and what our experiences are, and we need to learn from them how we can best work with them throughout the 9 Bay Area counties. And so as soon as John heard that, for some reason he jumped up, his hands were waving and said, we want to be first. So Solano County is the guinea pig. This is the first time we've actually brought this show on the road to an audience such as yours. And the thing that we really need from you all is your participation. As you see the agenda, you'll see at 10:30 and 11:15, you all are going to be on the stage. You all are going to be asking the questions, and you all are going to be finding out the answers, because that's the way we tend to work. So there's no leaving before 12:25, just so you know. The objective is pretty clear. When BCDC founded the ART program, the Adapting to Rising Tides program, we did so in great part because we knew that local governments, special districts, counties, regional agencies needed to get a framework through which they could work in order to do a couple things. Not only provide resilience for the Bay Area, all 9 counties, but work in a way in which we are not paralyzed. So many folks take a look at earthquakes and say, I can't do anything about it, and so it's hard to really get individuals prepared. We at BCDC look at rising sea level and think to ourselves exactly what one of Mark Hughes and my former colleagues used to call it, as a slow-moving emergency. We all know it's coming. It actually has already started. The question is, how can we prepare future generations to deal with it? And that's what ART really does. It provides a way to talk about it, a way to deal with it, a way to strategize about it, and actually get people talking in a very cooperative, coordinated way. And that's something that Lindy Lowe and Wendy and all the folks you're going to meet today have really become expert at. They know how to do this on a retail level, and that's incredibly, incredibly important. So with that being said, I will simply say one more thing. The BCDC covers 9 counties, and one of the counties that is most affected by sea level rise is San Mateo County, and in San Mateo County is SFO. We've all flown in and out of SFO. To buttress what Supervisor Spering just said, the Chief of Staff at SFO has looked at me a number of times, and Julian has said, you know, I can raise the levees. We'll change the glide slope a little bit, the runways will be safe, the terminals will be safe. But you know, Larry, nobody's going to be able to get to SFO because 101's underwater. So when we think about how Solano County works, we can't just think about the shoreline. We have to think about how people and goods move throughout the county and how the whole system is a network. And that's really one of the great things you'll learn about today, which is how ART looks at networks in addition to looking at specific slices of the pie. So with that, let me give it to Lindy and off we go.
Thank you, Larry. I don't think I have to make my presentation now. You did such a great job with the lead-in. I want to thank everybody for being here today. It's a really pretty day out there. And I want to start by saying, what is the ART program? The ART program started out as a pilot project in Alameda County. And it started out as an initiative to see how can we do this work at varying scales. And Larry talked about all of the scales that we work within, up from the regional scale down to the city and neighborhood and component scale. And so the ART project is an initiative to increase the resilience of current and future Bay Area communities, because we can't just think about where growth currently is, we have to think about where growth is going to go. So sea level rise, storm flooding, and other current and future hazards. Sea level rise is a slow-moving disaster, to quote Larry, but it's also the storm events that we have to take under consideration as well. And there are certain areas around the Bay Area now that flood fairly regularly, and that's something that we take into consideration in the Adapting to Rising Tides program. The project is multi-sector and cross-jurisdictional because we found that that's the way you really find out what the real vulnerabilities are and real adaptation strategies that will be needed.
Can you use the mic?
I thought I was. Maybe I need to hold it. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. It's multi-sector and cross-jurisdictional, and not only were we doing the work in Alameda County, we were also testing and refining the adaptation planning methods that we were developing. And one of the things that was said today is absolutely true. We're constantly adapting the program in response to things, questions and issues and things that we hear local jurisdictions and counties and regional agencies say. And you'll see some of that in the posters that demonstrate the way that we've adapted the program over time. The ART approach has some very specific components to it. We, throughout the process, from identifying existing conditions all the way through how we rank adaptation strategies, we include equity, economy, environment, and governance throughout. It can be applied to different geographies, sectors, and hazards. Heat is an issue that's going to be a significant issue for Solano County probably in the future decades. And this is an approach you can use to assess your heat hazards. It convenes and engages working groups to build local capacity and develop outcomes that resonate locally. If we're sitting at BCDC's office and we're developing vulnerabilities and adaptation strategies and approaches for you to use and we don't actually work with you in a room, it's probably not going to resonate with you locally. So we get out and we work with the jurisdictions that we're developing strategies for. It's very important to us that it's a transparent process, that you understand from the beginning to end what are the goals that we're starting out with, so that we can measure those goals later on when we get to adaptation strategies and to the selection of adaptation strategies. And it establishes a clear roadmap for taking action. It's both broad scale and focus. And one of the things that we found in the ART project and a recommendation that we have is that we recommend that you start at the broad scale because it identifies those functional vulnerabilities that both Commissioner Spering and Executive Director Goldspan mentioned, which is if you can't get to the airport, it doesn't matter that you protected the airport. And so if you start at that broad scale, you're able to identify those cross-jurisdictional, multi-sector vulnerabilities. And then you are able to also use the information that you developed at the broad scale to do more focused assessments. And we have a couple of examples where that's actually worked in the city of Benicia and the city of Hayward. When we started ART in Alameda, these were the asset categories that we included. And we started out with 5, and we ended up with 12 or 13. We started out with 5, and we recommended that to the folks that were in the room with us, all the local jurisdictions and county, state, federal folks, and they said, oh no, you need to include stormwater, you need to include, and they were absolutely right. If we hadn't included all of these different asset categories, we would have missed some really important vulnerabilities. But it was a lot more work. We pride ourselves on the fact that we bring audiences together or working group members together that generally don't work together very often. And usually if they do work together, they work together on specific projects. So we had East Bay Regional Park District sitting next to Caltrans, sitting next to the Oakland International Airport, and they learned from each other as well as we learned from them. And it was a very, very important aspect of the project to have everybody moving along together. One of the things that we found collaboration leads to is not just that people start to get along better and understand each other's languages, but it actually leads to outcomes. One of the great examples is when we started the Adapting to Rising Tides project, we started it at about the same time the regional housing mitigation, the county mitigation program was starting. And it was about 2011, 2010. And we didn't know each other was doing the other project. So shame on us, but that was how we used to do things. And then through the work that we were doing with ART, we had the Association of Area Governments in the room. We had all of these people in the room, and they started to tell us the work that they were doing. And so what we started to do is work with the other agencies and jurisdictions to develop programs and projects together. So we've conducted 2 projects with Federal Highway Administration money with MTC, Caltrans, and BART. BART conducted a vulnerability assessment of its own assets, and the Capital Corridor, JPA, took the work that we've been doing in ART and refined it for their assets. And then we started to work in a way that we started to combine and build upon the information that we were developing in ART, the information that was being developed in the hazard mitigation program. And now we're at a stage where we're working with ABAG on the regional hazard mitigation program. They're working with us on the county-wide vulnerability assessments that we're conducting. And all of this is leading into information that we're developing for the Sustainable Communities chapter. I want to run through some findings from the ART program pretty quickly because I wanted to get to Chris May. We found that our findings grouped into 4 basic categories. We had information vulnerabilities, and those information vulnerabilities were widespread throughout all of the asset categories that we looked at. Information is hard to get to, and sometimes even if it does exist, it's not accessible. An example of that is a lack of elevation data for the transportation infrastructure. It's a significant vulnerability for us because we don't know in some cases what's vulnerable or what's most vulnerable because we don't know what the elevation is. We also have lack of information on elevation, condition, and ownership for shorelines. And so that's our first line of defense, our shoreline protection. If we don't know how high it is, if we don't know what the condition is, and sometimes we don't even know who owns it, we may be protected by something that is too low, in poor condition, and owned by somebody who doesn't know they're responsible for protecting us. It's an incredible information vulnerability. We also grouped our vulnerabilities under governance. And governance challenges also exist at most of the asset categories, or all of the asset categories that we looked at. I'm going to give some examples. Along the Hayward shoreline, the management, regulatory, and financing processes that were designed to address issues are not set up to address cross-jurisdictional and multiple sector issues. And so along the Hayward shoreline, you have East Bay Regional Park District owns the shoreline. There's a lot of regional transportation infrastructure and wastewater and stormwater infrastructure. And you have a lot of folks and you have a uniformly low shoreline. And so you are in a situation where not one agency can protect themselves, and everybody needs to work together. It's a governance vulnerability because none of our processes are set up for that. Who is going to be the lead on the CEQA document? Who is going to finance and fund it? And so it's a big challenge. And although we don't want to be stuck, that kind of situation makes us feel stuck. And so trying to develop processes and strategies to address these kinds of vulnerabilities are going to be really important. The Oakland Bay Forum Island example is the same example Larry gave for SFO, and the Oakland International Airport has the same problem, in that if you protect the airport, the roadways leading to the airport are still vulnerable, and a lot of Oakland International Airport is vulnerable by a road they don't own. And so Northfield, the general aviation airport at Oakland International, will be flooded by a road that they don't have control over. And then in Alameda County, the work that we did with Capital Corridor identified Capital Corridor provides passenger service on track that they do not own and is protected by shoreline protection that they do not own. We also have functional vulnerabilities, and some of those are related to governance vulnerabilities. Network systems, as Commissioner Spering talked about, are only as protected as their weakest link. So your lowest point, your weakest condition, that's what you have to worry about. If one part of the Capital Corridor line gets wet, it goes out. There's parts of BART that if that component gets wet, the BART system shuts down. And so those are the pieces that we need to understand our systems from a system perspective, but also down to a component perspective so that we can understand those kinds of vulnerabilities. And one of the things we found is that although buildings are uniformly in some ways vulnerable or protected if they're raised or built a certain way, the functions in those buildings are very different. And so if you have certain kinds of populations living in certain buildings, like the very young, elderly, medically dependent you are more or less vulnerable based on those things. You're easier to evacuate or harder to evacuate. It's very hard to rehouse people who are medically dependent, who rely on certain things. And it's also very hard if you have an elder care facility in a floodplain that suddenly the access is flooded. They can't get to that facility. If folks can't get to that facility for 2 or 3 days, those folks weren't flooded, but the things that they rely on were not provided to them. And so there are certain functions of structures that we really have to take into consideration, not just the buildings themselves. And then there are those physical aspects, which is usually what most of us start with when we think about what gets flooded and what's going to happen when it gets flooded. And most of our infrastructure, our buildings, and our utilities are not constructed in a way either elevated or protected to get wet because we haven't confronted significant flooding in most of our region in the past. Some of our really important assets are underground, like our transportation assets and some of our utilities and pipelines. And some of our electronic and mechanical components are not at all able to get wet. And some of our pump stations that we use to respond to flooding have mechanical components that are underground. And so when those get wet, or haven't been maintained, and when those get wet, you can't pump. So I want to move on to some of the projects that we've been working on in the ART program. The ones with the solid bullets are completed, and I just talked a lot about what we found in Alameda County, but we also have been working in the transportation assessments with BART, Caltrans, and MTC. We worked with BART on their climate adaptation plan, the capital corridor assessment. We conducted a sector-specific assessment for East Bay Regional Park District, and the Hayward Resilient Shoreline Study, and then some work that we've been doing with the Association of Area Governments, Bay Area Housing and Community Risk Assessment. And now we're working in the Oakland Alameda. This is another example of where we started broad. We identified some significant vulnerabilities that required a more focused assessment. So we're doing that in the Oakland Airport, Oakland Coliseum, Alameda location. We started a new we started a new project in Contra Costa County, similar to the work that we did in Alameda, and it's multi-jurisdictional and multi-asset. And then we've been what I'd like to call help desk, providing help desk support for the Benicia Adaptation Project. I talked a little bit about this in the working together slide and how collaborating on art, getting everybody in the room in the beginning in 2011 for the pilot project really led to outcomes of real collaboration and developing information together. And now this is leading to, again, us working on these projects together. And it's the regional agencies plus the local jurisdictions and the counties and trying to get everybody involved so that we don't have to come to the city of Benicia or the city of Hayward 4 times and say, we need your asset information because we're developing the regional hazard mitigation plan. Well, we need your asset information because we're doing an adaptation process. And the other thing we've heard from folks is please don't tell us to address our flooding problems when we're also being told to address our seismic problems and we're also being told to address. So we're sensitive to that issue. So trying to develop a comprehensive program that is about sustainability and resilience, that's a one-stop shop. That's the ideal situation. We're not quite there yet, but we're trying to get there. And then the other thing we've been working on is developing a how-to portfolio for folks to provide help desk support in a more direct way it gives you the tools in your own hands. The art portfolio, which will probably be released in April, has the findings from the project, and we update those regularly as we come up with new findings. Has the projects that we've been working on either completed and all of the content for those projects and links to that content. It has how-tos, and we've gotten down to the point where we've developed draft process agendas for folks, exercises that you can use at different stages in your project, different strategies and tools to communicate information. And then we have committed to providing help desk support. So if you're on the art portfolio and you're trying to run through a process yourself and you get stuck in a place, we're there to answer your questions, help you through a step, and potentially attend the meeting and make a presentation. And then the other thing, and this is leading into Chris May's presentation that we've been working very hard on, is trying to develop a regional, a consistent regional approach to the data and information that folks can use for what gets wet, so to speak. And so the work that we've been doing with FEMA over the last 3 years, 4 years, 4 years, has been to make sure that, again, when we come to you and we start talking about flood levels and water levels, you're not saying, well, FEMA just came to us 3 weeks ago and told us something completely different. We wanted to make sure we were on the same page, and one of the things we're working with Alameda County Flood Control that we heard is we absolutely need to get on the same page. So it's been a really powerful way for us to move forward. And I think both BCDC and the agencies that have been working with the Adapting to Rise and Tides program and FEMA have learned a lot from each other in terms of what works, what's valuable. And so hopefully you'll hear a little bit about that from Chris. I don't know if we have any type of questions.
I don't even know how to double click on a Mac. Well, my name is Chris May, and I'm really happy to be here to talk about really the long-term collaboration that we've had between BCDC and FEMA to better understand our flood risk. So why I am here is because I don't work for FEMA, but I work for Baker AECOM, which is their primary contractor, leading all of the coastal hazard and analysis studies in the state of California. And I have been leading the San Francisco Bay Area Coastal Study, which is bringing you your brand new flood insurance rate maps that better represent your coastal hazards for current conditions. And although not everyone likes to see me when I come to their community to present the flood insurance rate maps, this study is really an amazing study, and it provides a great wealth of information on how we can understand our tides, our storm surge, and our waves. And this provides a great comprehensive regional data set along the entire San Francisco Bay shoreline, not just Solano County. But if you do have additional FEMA questions, I'll point out that Eric Simmons with FEMA is also in the room today. So just to give you just a quick snapshot on where we are with the FEMA study in Solano County. We have had several recent meetings with Solano County, and I have to say that this meeting has a much better turnout than any of our FEMA meetings, which is really great to see. But we were just here about 3 weeks ago on February 5th to talk about the preliminary flood insurance rate maps that have been released for Solano County. So if you are not aware that this data set is now available, all of this information is available on the FEMA Map Services Center and also at r9coastal.org. R9 is FEMA Region 9. So we're currently leading up to the 90-day appeal period where Solano County and the communities can review and provide comments on the preliminary firms. And this is a really high-level picture of the flood map in Solano County. So all of that blue, those are areas that are within the FEMA Special Flood Hazard Area. But I'm really not here to talk to you about the FEMA flood insurance rate maps. But what I want to talk about is how all of this data from that FEMA study can really be used to have a deeper understanding that can help people understand both current and future flood risk. FEMA spends a lot of money on these studies. It's not easy to do a comprehensive coastal flood hazard and risk assessment for the entire San Francisco Bay Area. But the modeling is complex when we want to be able to look at what that 100-year or that 1% annual chance flood risk is. So we have a large-scale regional hydrodynamic model that really allows us to tease apart. So the 1% seas, that is your 100-year wave heights along the bay shoreline. And we have that information at a really high density, really over 8,000 points along the shoreline from that regional model. It also provides us the 1% surge, which is that 1% 100-year tidal water levels. And that's one of the primary elements that FEMA is mapping. But it also provides us the 1% swell, which is those large ocean waves that travel through the Golden Gate. And as you can see from this graphic, that's really a primary interest to the Central Bay communities. Those larger waves through the Golden Gate aren't really impacting Solano County. But to get these three figures for FEMA, we had to do, there's a lot of data behind this study. And what we're trying to do in our collaboration with BCDC is mine this data to better support regional resilience. So this is a graphic I borrowed from Wendy Goodfriend, but it kind of talks about all of the steps that you go through when you are looking at your shoreline resilience and trying to develop adaptation or mitigation strategies to help lessen your flood risk. So the ones that I'm going to be talking about today are really focused more at the top of the pyramid, and that's unlocking the FEMA water level data, and a unique approach to looking at sea level rise maps, and also looking at your regional shoreline and flood infrastructure. So there's a lot of good reasons to understand our bay water levels. We need this for hydrodynamic modeling, for restoration, for project planning, for permitting. But really the number one reason why we want all this data to understand our bay water levels is if we want to know how the tides and the storm surge and the waves are going to change in the future with sea level rise and climate change, we have to understand those conditions at the present. And we need to understand them at a very local scale along the shoreline. So this shows you a map of your FEMA 100-year still water elevations, that 100-year extreme tide around the bay. And it varies from about 9 feet in ABD 88 to 12 feet down in the South Bay. You know, water levels are not flat. We have a significant amount of variation throughout the bay. But from that data set, we can look at more than just that 100-year extreme tide that we're mapping for FEMA. It can be used to understand a wealth of data, including looking at other extreme tide elevations, ranging from the 1-year extreme tide, which is comparable to the type of flooding you would see with a king tide, you know, every year in the Bay Area. But you can look at the 2-year, the 5-year, the 25-year, and then all the way up to the 100-year, which is the FEMA regulatory standard. We can also look at tidal datums, and I'm not sure how many people understand what a tidal datum is, but these are really important basic water elevations that you need to know in planning projects. You need to know how high the tides are under daily high tide conditions, how low the tide gets you know, under tidal conditions, and what your tidal range is. And from the FEMA study, we can extract really all of the local tidal datums along the shoreline, at all of these points along the shoreline. And why I think this is really cool is that, so these red triangles, those show the locations where NOAA has tide gauge information within the bay that would be similar to all of that data along the shoreline. But there's really only 3 tide stations that I've circled with green circles that have a long enough tide record to give you all of that information. So if you want to know what that is around your piece of the shoreline, you would need to hire a coastal engineer to do those transformations for you. But with this data set that we've developed from mining the FEMA data, you now have that at over 900 points along the shoreline. It's conveniently located where you need the information for your sea level rise planning, for your flood risk awareness, and for your projects. So I also want to introduce a concept that's one map can equal many features. And this is something that we've developed really by mining that data through our collaboration with BCDC. Typically when I present this, I use the maps for Alameda County, which we originally developed this concept for the art project. But it's being adopted by other users around the Bay, including the city and county of San Francisco. So what this map shows is the amount of inundation San Francisco would have along the shoreline with 12 inches of sea level rise, which is about what we expected mid-century. But based on the water level analysis, this is also the level of inundation you would see under an existing king tide every year. And as you can see, you're not really seeing a lot of blue along the shoreline here. I mean, they do have overtopping and flooding, but it's really localized and small. When you move up to 24 inches of sea level rise, I don't know if you can see it well on the screen, but there are more little areas of blue that pop out. But through the water level analysis, this same map can be used to visualize the amount of flooding San Francisco could see with just a 5-year extreme tide level, which is similar to the tide levels that we had on December 11th, when we had some significant storms come in. And there's other scenarios that this map can be used to illustrate as well, but I'm just trying to relate them back to existing conditions. So here's a map with 36 inches of sea level rise. This is our most likely sea level rise projection, based on the current state of the science. But this can also be used to represent how much area could be flooded under existing conditions with the 50-year tide. The main difference being with 36 inches of sea level rise, that area would be getting wet every day. But with a storm surge event, with a 50-year extreme tide, that's just a temporary inundation hazard. But you can use this map to try and figure out what areas are inundated, what are my areas of greatest risk. And we looked at this all the way up to, skip to the last one, to looking at 107 inches of sea level rise, which sounds like a lot, but using, beyond what we see at 2100, but using that water level analysis, this is like the worst case scenario that San Francisco is currently planning for. This is what they're calling their sea level rise vulnerability zone. And this is what you could see as flooded with 66 inches of sea level rise, so the upper range of the current science, and a 100-year storm surge event. And if you can see the blue now, there's a significant more areas that are flooded along the San Francisco shoreline. So using that water level analysis to tie into the map so you can have one map represent many features, it gives you a great wealth of information for your planning and making risk-based decisions for your community. So since I showed the maps that were developed for the city and county of San Francisco, I'm just going to show you the disclaimer that had to go through legal review that goes on every map, because they wanted to make it clear that those maps are just planning tools. It's not a prediction of what's going to happen in the future. But I have to say this is the longest disclaimer I've ever had to put on a map. So now I want to talk about how we can extend that information even further to merge all of that water level data with a shoreline delineation along the bay. For the Adapting to Rising Tides project, we developed a shoreline delineation approach to really delineate all of the flood protection structures which prevent inland inundation. And this was a really helpful tool for both understanding where things were overtopped, but also what kind of adaptation strategies were possible. And it's really exciting that now the SFEI, the San Francisco Estuary Institute, is taking that approach that was developed for the art project, and they're working on making this information available bay-wide, including for Solano County. So this is delineating, all of the infrastructure and looking at not just what is it and where is it, but what's the elevation, what's the condition, And this helps highlight both our vulnerable locations, but also opportunities and risks. So this is an example of some of that shoreline delineation information, and this is in Marin County. But it's going through, this is not focused just on FEMA engineered levees. There is a lot of other infrastructure that can help prevent flood inundation. And that includes, natural shorelines, transportation structures like roadway embankments and rail embankments, berms, non-engineered embankments. So this captures all of the infrastructure, so it can give you a different picture of your risk beyond just looking at the FEMA flood insurance rate map. I mean, for FEMA, these non-engineered features, they can't be fully accounted for to help prevent the flood risk. But using this approach, it allows you to see, like Lindsay was saying, how many areas their primary protection is really a rail embankment or a highway embankment and not an engineered flood protection structure. So then we can take all that water level data. Once we have that full shoreline delineation, we can transfer that water level data onto that infrastructure map so that we can see which of those features is the water level overtopping and which of those features do we still have freeboard? What's the elevation of that structure above a certain water level that goes with those many features? And this is a really powerful tool for helping us see, this is the San Francisco Bay Bridge touchdown. And when you look at this level of inundation, everybody's like, oh my goodness, I don't know how to solve that. But if you pair it with a shoreline delineation, it actually highlights. So I don't have a pointer, so I'll just walk in front of the screen. But this whole area, all of these floodwaters are really coming from overtopping that occurs down here. So when you have that regional shoreline data set and that overtopping information, it can help you understand your flood risk and develop really localized adaptation strategies that can help address significant problems. Just because there's significant inundation doesn't mean that the entire shoreline is necessarily overtopped. So this helps you focus and identify your weak links or your vulnerable points. So I'm just going to show another example of this, again from San Francisco, and you can see the disclaimer here up on the corner of the map. But if I just focus in on this one area, so this is another area where there was a lot of inundation. And when you pair it with the shoreline delineation, you can see that the inundation overtopping is coming from one side and not from both sides, and so it would better allow them to develop or look towards developing adaptation strategies. But if I go back to this big overall picture, this scenario, this is 36 inches of sea level rise, so that most likely scenario, and it's not too bad. There's a lot of areas where we could focus small-scale adaptation strategies and help shore up these weak links. But this one map equals many futures scenario and the depth of this information, it also helps you look at when you start to reach that tipping point where maybe you can no longer do just these small projects along the shoreline to help shore up your weak links, and you really need to start looking at more regional solutions. And I think, that's the worst case scenario that we mapped. And so if you can see the colors along the shoreline, that's showing the depth of overtopping. So when you see everything showing up in the red and the hot pink, that's all having significant overtopping. And so you would need to do a substantial project there to prevent that inundation if you don't want to try retreat. So we don't have all the answers yet for how to fix these regional problems because they are substantial in San Francisco Bay when we have significant low-lying areas all along the shoreline. But these regional tools and data sets are really putting us, giving us all the tools so we can address this common challenge. It's helping to provide us information to deal with it locally, but also providing the tools to deal with it regionally and develop kind of a unifying language and understanding of our flood risk to storm surge, to tides, and also to sea level rise. I just want to point out that this data is not all available quite yet, although some of it is, but we are working in a collaborative effort to make it available as soon as we can. April or early summer, but it's been a collaborative effort with FEMA, Alameda County Flood Control and Water Conservation District, which really allowed us to pilot a lot of these ideas, BCDC, AACOM, and then also SFEI. Thank you.
Good afternoon now. I'm Brad McCray, the Director of the Regulatory Program at BCDC, and I'm going to run through a number of slides in about 10 or 15 minutes, give some time for questions. And I know Chair Wasserman has some closing statements, and so we'll try to get you out of here at 12:25. This is our jurisdiction. If you took a lasso and just threw it around the bay, it's something like this. This is give or take about a mile. But this is, as the director of the regulatory program, I can say to do it this way. If my staff did it, I'd have a problem. This is closer to home here. Here in the county, our jurisdiction, and I'm going to take some liberties and throw another lasso around it, is about like this. This gives you sort of the picture of where BCDC gets involved in regulatory decisions in this area. It includes, of course, the Suisun Marsh, both the primary and secondary management areas. It involves the Napa River up to just past the airport, the ponds that have been restored, and the shoreline, 100 feet from mean high tide. We've worked a lot, as been said earlier, with the cities, the local municipalities, and the counties on different projects, certainly in Suisun. The restoration of Cullinan Ranch that was breached just recently. We have salinity control gates, this water control structure up on Montezuma Slough years ago, and as I mentioned, the marsh itself, issuing permits for the primary management area and having an appeal process for the secondary management area. What we need to do is we're also encompassing not what we've done in the past, which is to be a regulatory agency that's focused on two things: preventing unnecessary fill and maximizing public access. But we're also looking to the future now. And until a regional adaptation strategy, or even a sub-regional adaptation strategy, as you've heard all morning, is created, we're looking at projects on a case-by-case basis, because that's what our policies, our relatively new, 3-ish year old policies, are directing us to do. And this case-by-case basis is pretty straightforward, although it's taken us a few years to get comfortable in actually teaching ourselves how to do it. One of the things that we look at when we look at a site is where sort of high tide is now and where low tide is now. I mean, here's in Benicia, the low tide. And if the low tide in the future, after just a foot or two of sea level rise occurred, or when it occurs, it would be there. And if that's low tide in the future, then you can imagine where high tide would be. And if you can imagine where high tide with the storm would be. And so over the last several years, we've issued permits all around the bay, and I'll go over a few of them here, for development projects both in the bay and within the shoreline band, which is that 100-foot jurisdiction inland and parallel to mean high tide, with an eye towards the climate change policies. And I'll talk a little bit about projects, and I'll talk a little bit about those policies. This is a project that the Commission recently saw and approved. It's an office project in Burlingame. This project was designed and will be built to be resilient to mid-century, to 2050. And they've created an adaptation strategy about how they will adapt to the end of the century, based on some sea level rise projections that we agreed to. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Here's another project. This is Port of San Francisco. It's at Crane Cove Park, 9-acre public park at Pier 70. Sea level rise adaptation is sort of built into the evolution of the park experience. It's kind of an interesting approach to developing a park. For example, this historic shipway will be allowed to flood. As the water rises, the water will rise up the shipway. There's a maritime facility, this is WEDA, the Water Emergency Transportation Agency that's in Alameda. We looked at their elevations to make sure they are above high tides of the future. This park here at the base of the Bay Bridge, Gateway Park, is being designed to be resilient to increasing tides. This is a 170-acre park that can serve multiple benefits in the future. And certainly out in the middle of the bay, there's a plan for 8,000 new homes, 450 square feet of retail and 500 hotel rooms and a new ferry terminal and hundreds of acres of open space at Treasure Island and Yerba Buena Island. Now, Treasure Island is, as you saw in some slides earlier, is particularly vulnerable to inundation in the future. And their adaptation strategy does a couple of things, sort of leaving enough room to adapt, strengthening the perimeter, and doing something that not a lot of folks have done yet, and that is to create a financial mechanism to pay for future adaptation. They'll create an assessment material. So how do we do with this? How do we go through that process of sitting down with developers and talking about conformance with our climate change policies? Well, the first thing that our policies talk about is preparing a risk assessment. And it says if you're planning the shoreline, larger shoreline area, if you're planning for some stretch of your community, or designing a larger project, a risk assessment is required. And it goes, the San Francisco Bay Plan sort of outlines what is included in that. A range of projections, inundation maps, potential flooding, degrees of uncertainty, what happens if the defense that you've created fails, and then also this risk to existing habitat from using these protection devices. A lot of times if you harden the shoreline, it has impacts on adjacent or nearby marshes. So those are all kind of things that go into this tool to get everyone to sort of understand what are we working with. And if the risk assessment identifies that the project is vulnerable to flooding, then the policy has a sort of a two-step approach. You should certainly design it to mid-century, which now is only 35 years away. And so maybe a foot or more of water will be there. And how are you going to address that? But you should also have a strategy for how to get to the end of the century. We ask the developers and the consultants to actually look into the future and show us what they might be able to do in the future. Now, this is a question we get asked a lot, right? What's the number? And as you heard this morning, I think I won't go over a lot of it. Matter of fact, I deleted a slide or two for the sake of time because Chris May went over some of these things. The short answer is, well, it sort of depends. We're about right here, right? 2015. You can see that mid-century, just 35 years away, is about where accelerated sea level rise occurs. There's an acceleration that happens in the sea level rise scenarios that the scientists are telling us. And if you're going to design something that's going to be out here, say a residential subdivision, lots of people living in homes near the bay, near the shoreline, wherever you are around the bay, maybe you want to take a different approach than if you're doing a somewhat temporary self-storage site that might be able to be torn down in a few years, right? And used for some higher or some different use. So that's one of the sort of the vulnerability and the duration of the structure. Now, the National Research Council gave us some numbers, gave us a range, and if you look at 2100, they said 17 to 66. Well, that's kind of from here to here. They said, the recommendation is about 3 feet. At BCDC, we look at the 2050 and the 2100, and we say that we really should be on be prudent, be on the higher side. Now, 12 inches at mid-century is a number we often use. Some people are choosing to go a little bit higher for mid-century. 3 feet plus is what we're using for end of century. One of the things what we do is we create, Larry mentioned it earlier, this layer cake. And I'll go into that in the next slide. But it really is based in part on where mean high water is. You don't want to start putting your sea level rise scenario on a low tide because that doesn't work so well. And so you have the mean high water with the sea level rise scenario. But one of the important things is that storms are part of the equation. And Chris talked about that this morning, about the 100-year flood, right? The still water elevation. And adding that to the mix so that we have this total water level. So let me give you an example of how that played out for one project called Blue Harbor down in Redwood City. It's located out on a peninsula, relatively muted tidal action. It's not open to the open bay. There's a series of creeks and sloughs in this area. There's not a lot of fetch, if any. It's a residential subdivision, about 400 homes, 700 residents, and so what their proposal was, and there was no fill in the bay. This was all above mean high tide was what they were. It was all development on land. There's no fill involved. This is an example of a common cross-section that tells a lot of the story for each and every project. And what you have is this mean high water elevation. Right? You start with the high tide, and then you add on to it what it says BFE there. It's the base flood elevation, which is that 100-year water level. And then on top of that, you have 3 different bars. What you're looking at is 2050, 2070, and 2100. What these folks chose to do is to not use 3 feet or even 1 foot and plan for the future. They said, you know what, let's just do it now. And you can see here, this dashed line represents the existing grade at the site. They said, we're just going to put 55 inches, we're going to project for, plan for 55 inches of sea level rise, and we're going to create our shoreline so that it's resilient to that number. And we're not going to burden the homeowners association or anyone else with future decisions about getting out of the way of higher water. Now, that's a strategy that works. But today, well, when it gets built in the next couple of years, what we might have is a scenario where we're now 10 feet above the bay as it exists today, right? Or 5 or whatever that number is. This is at elevation 6.4, and this is at elevation 15, so we're 9 feet above mean high tide. Right? So one of the things that you need to think about when you're designing for the future is maybe these incremental steps. The actions we're taking today has a result of how we experience the day. And perhaps that there's an incremental step that also is equally as good. Treasure Island, as I talked about, has a lot going on. What they did is they created this strengthening at the perimeter. They have wide setbacks where the buildings are, in this case, 300 feet from the shoreline, so it gives them room to adapt in the future. They elevated their development areas, and then they did something interesting. They have this adaptive approach to letting the bay waters actually come onto the island down in here. That's what the cross-section those crosshatches represented. Now, we don't really do that a lot in the United States. We don't really give our land away even to Mother Nature. But that's what this proposes, is that this is 350 feet. The recreational trail would be built out here. There would be some tidal interaction, seasonal tidal, seasonal marsh or something. And then as the water rises, it would just flow back and you would move the trail back to this area. So although the project is largely defended, and this is will be a sort of a levee protected community, in one side they're saying, well, we'll just let this, we won't spend the money to defend it, we'll just have it be sacrificial, which is a really forward-thinking approach, I think. More locally, we could do something, perhaps there are simpler approaches. Each site is different, and that's why we have this policy that talks about case-by-case studying. Now, as you look to the future, you might want to do something bolder. This came from a design competition that we held many years ago. But you don't have to come up with that sort of futuristic development. But what does need to be done is to think about today, what the future holds. And then take a look at those challenges to a rising bay. Because we've often said that there are likely to be opportunities, both environmental and economic opportunities that come with sea level rise. And in the Bay Area, of course, we have this long history of addressing challenges. We did it, the state did it 50 years ago when it created BCDC and stopped the Bay from getting smaller, and we can do it again, certainly, as we look to the challenges of the future and plan for the Bay to get larger. Thanks so much.